From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman, and the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, for our episode 50. 50 done of these. It's been almost a year, but 50, I don't know, seems a nice round number. We'll take it from there. David, we have a very interesting guest today. Tell us who we have.
Well, Sarah Palin just called, and she said if we do one more episode, we'll have one for each state in America. Our guest today is investigative reporter James Ridgeway. He and Ralph Nader go back a long way. Ralph had written Unsafe at Any Speed and was working as a consultant on a Senate committee looking into auto safety when Ridgeway's reporting in the New Republic broke the story about General Motors spying on and trying to smear Ralph, a story Mr. Ridgeway retold in the documentary An Unreasonable Man. In a long and storied career, James Ridgeway has written not only for the New Republic, but for Ramparts, the Wall Street Journal, The Nation, Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, just to name a few. And he was also the senior Washington correspondent for both The Village Voice and Mother Jones. Ridgeway is the author of 16 books, including most recently The 5 Unanswered Questions About 9/11 and It's All for Sale, The Control of Global Resources. At the moment, Mr. Ridgeway is working on a project called Solitary Watch, a web-based project aimed at bringing the widespread use of solitary confinement out of the shadows and into the light of the public square. Ralph Nader, please welcome James Ridgeway.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome, James Ridgeway. What you're going to hear in this program, listeners, may be hard to stomach because the level of cruelty is beyond most people's expectation levels who know anything about prisons in the U.S. today. Jim, let me ask you the first question. You've gone into a lot of areas of investigative reporting, and now you're really focusing on the solitary confinement of about 80,000 people in the jails in the U.S. Why did you decide to focus so insistently on this and start Solitary Watch?
Well, I was working for Mother Jones, and one of my assignments was to cover the Angola Three. Those were 3 guys in Louisiana, and they had been in solitary for close to 40 years. And I couldn't believe it. You know, I hardly knew what solitary was. I've been in various prisons, but I really was not aware of anything like this. And so I wrote a couple of stories based on court papers. And I asked the prison to let me come and talk to these guys and to talk to the warden. And after they read the first story, the prison PR woman said, "We don't like you." And I said, "Well, why?" And she said, "Well, we just don't like what you write." And I said, "Well, what don't you like? Let's not go into that." So I couldn't come. So what I did was I went to a lot of very, very fancy lawyers, very high-class people, and I asked them if they wouldn't take a suit to force this thing open. And they all just laughed and said, you know, the Supreme Court had held this, such and such, and it would be impossible. So I kind of dropped it. Then finally, this young woman who ran the ACLU in New Orleans, she got into it, and she said, well, we're going to sue. We're going to go for these guys. And so she put together a whole legal team of herself and various assistants, and backed up by a lot of, or several high-class, very high-class established legal firms in New Orleans. And we got ready to litigate. Suddenly, the warden gave in, and he said we could come and have a tour. And they said, you can come and you can tour this prison and do anything you want. You can tape it, you can photograph it, you can film it, you can talk to anybody you want. But just remember, we're taping and filming and photographing you. So I said, okay, well, can I come and also talk to the warden? And they said, yes, he'll be there. So I went to the prison, which is, you know, a huge prison, has 5,000 people in it. And it once was a group of southern plantations, slave plantations. And they were very pleasant to me, and they gave me a trip around, and they took me to the walk. And I walked down, and they kept introducing me to people. And I went with the PR woman, and I was followed by, 3 ranks of, lieutenants, captains, assistant wardens, whatever.
No dogs?
I didn't see any dogs. But they would keep coming up and, they were real friendly with the prisoners. And the prisoners, never made eye contact and kind of shrank. And they said, you could say whatever you want, talk to them, whatever you want. And I said, no, I'm not talking to anybody, because I knew there'd be instant retribution to anybody who said a word, critical of the warden. So we went to the chapel, and which is, the warden is an evangelical. And he was very proud of his ability to bring most of the people in this prison to Christ. And he had various, smaller chapels around. And the place was sort of open to any evangelical ministry that wanted to come in and spend a day or two, whatever. So we went to the chapel, and again, the people were extremely nice. And I did say to one of them, what happens if the warden doesn't like what you're preaching, what you're talking about? And he pointed up and he said, he'll decide, meaning Jesus, I guess, or God. So then I went out and we went and we had lunch. And they had the inmates making cookies and hamburgers and stuff. And it was all very nice, And then I said, okay, when can I see the warden? And they said, oh, well, the warden, was called away. He had to go to Atlanta for a special conference. So, it's like getting a tour of Washington, D.C. You get to ride in a bus around in circles. Nobody talks to you. You have no idea what the hell is going on. And I left. And I began to think, this solitary confinement is really a big deal. And I began to think, well, why can't we get information on all these prisons that have got solitary confinement and put it out there so people can actually know about this? Because I began to talk to lawyers, and they said, well, you think 40 years is a lot. Well, my guys are all in for 10, 20, 30 years. And a lot of them were for nonviolent crimes.
Yeah, go into some of the reasons people are thrown into solitary confinement. After they've been sentenced and imprisoned in normal cells, what do they have to do, or what are they accused of doing that throws them into a cell? The average cell is what, 6 feet by 9 feet?
Yeah, 6 by 9 or 6 by 8, I think.
And the meals are what?
They're lousy meals that are shoved into a slot, and they're given showers maybe twice a week. And they're allowed to have rec room 2 or 3 times a week. Okay, so the rec room is like a dog run. It's protected all around by bulletproof glass and so on. And the top is protected. So you can run up and down in there. You're taken there in handcuffs and shackles, and they take off the shackles. I think they sometimes leave the handcuffs on, and you can walk around. And you have to be very careful that you don't get in a fight with somebody or that you don't get harmed in some way. Now, you want some examples of how you get to in solitary. Okay, so I've got a friend named Five. He's quite well known in New York, and he was in prison in New York State for 12 years, 5 of them in solitary. He got put into solitary at one point because he was eating an apple. He distributed apples. But he ate an apple, and then he ate the core of the apple. And the guard said, that's a ticket for you. You're going to the hole. And he said, why?
The whole meaning solitary.
Yeah, and he said, I'm just eating an apple. And he said, yeah, but you ate the core of the apple. Yeah, he said, so what? He said, well, that's arsenic. That's poison. You're trying to bring poison in here, and you're going to try to poison yourself. and Five looked at him and said, oh my God. You never thought of that. So that's like maybe one of the stories. Another story, there's a guy who's been trying to kill himself since the age of 5. He's very, very ill with, various kinds of mental illnesses. He got involved in a minor carjacking incident in Utica, and he was indicted and given a public defender who immediately did what most public defenders do, at least most state public defenders do, which is to do a plea. So I think he got maybe 2 years. So they took him and they recognized the fact that he was unstable, he was illiterate, he was probably retarded, and they put him in a mental unit. But they didn't just put him in a mental unit, because what most people don't know is that the mental unit also has solitary unit. So they put him in a solitary unit. So this guy, Adam Hall, who's another friend, I've become friends with these guys, and he then immediately tried to kill himself. He tried to get a wire into a plug and electrocute himself, and that didn't work. So to attract tension and to try to push his death along, he set fire to his cell. So then they took him out, and instead of, using prison methods of, they call it correction, whatever, they put him in front of another grand jury in Utica, civil grand jury, and they indicted him for arson. So now what happens is he gets another public defender, and the public defender pleads him out. Now his total time is up to 6 years, maybe 10 years. His mother, Carol Hall, who has been struggling for years to try to get help to this guy, she tries to talk to the public defender and explain to him and show him the records that show that he's, seriously mentally ill. The public defender won't talk to her. I tried to talk to the public defender, and of course he wouldn't talk to me. So Adam gave me power of attorney, which he probably didn't know what that was. And I said, well, I got power of attorney, and I sent them the papers. And they said, Adam Hall has instructed us never to talk to you. That was the very same day that Adam Hall called up his mother and said, where's Ridgeway? Why isn't he doing anything? So, you have this system that just completely, shuts you off,
Hearing you say this makes me want to just take an excerpt from your Solitary Watch. By the way, you can get more information about Jim's group, solitarywatch.com, and he has news from a nation in lockdown. Catch this, listeners. This is from one of the fact sheets. Quote, far from being a last resort measure reserved for the worst of the worst, solitary confinement has become a control strategy of first resort in many prisons. Today, inmates can be placed in complete isolation for months or years, not only for violent acts, but for possessing contraband, using drugs, ignoring orders, or using profanity. Thousands of prisoners are held in indefinite solitary confinement because they have been named as gang members by other inmates who are rewarded for the information. Others have ended up in solitary because they have untreated mental illnesses, are children in need of protection, are gay or transgender, are Muslim, have unsavory political beliefs, or report rape or abuse by prison officials. In Virginia, a dozen Rastafarian men have been in solitary for 10 years because they refused to cut their hair on religious grounds. We talk about Abu Ghraib in Iraq. When I heard the first news of that prison torture by U.S. military, I said to a reporter, why are you so surprised? You got Abu Ghraibs all over the United States. There is no Western country that so savagely treats nonviolent prisoners as the U.S. Wouldn't you say, Jim?
Well, yeah. Look, we have conservative estimate of 80,000 people in solitary all over the U.S., in near big cities, little towns, and so on. The British have 40 people. 40 people in solitary.
And they have a fifth of the population.
Right.
So let's say 5 times 40 is 200 to make it proportional. And we have how many in solitary confinement?
80,000.
Weren't there 2 African Americans who were in the infamous Angola prison? And how long did they stay there? One of them is still there?
Yeah, they stayed there 40 years. One of them got out, one of them's died, and there's another one still in solitary.
How do people avoid going crazy? I don't mean just people who are mentally ill before they go there, but, what do you do about people who have serious claustrophobic problems, or they don't see sunlight, they don't see air, they can't move? What's the psychological literature on this?
Well, the psychological literature and the psychiatrists who've looked at it, and there are only a few, because nobody wants to get involved in crime stuff or in prison stuff, because they figure the judges have done the work and they don't want to get into it. Anyhow, it's basically, that this kind of punishment induces people to go crazy. And there's some evidence that it actually affects the brain. So these guys are sick. I'll give you another story. One man wrote me that he was sitting outside the prison clinic, and he was about to slit his wrists, and he just couldn't take it anymore. He just wanted somebody to know that he was going to kill himself. So I couldn't take it, So I wrote him a letter, and I basically said to him, look, try to hold on a little bit, and we'll be in touch. You'll have somebody to write to. So he's become a big correspondent. He didn't kill himself. He wrote a letter to me. He didn't kill himself. But he said, I can't get out of solitary confinement because I'm so angry and so mad that if they put me in general population, I'm going to have a fight and I might very well kill somebody. So he didn't want to leave this 6x8 cell. because he was afraid of what he would do.
You're getting testimonies from these prisoners, aren't you? I mean, you get some actually video testimonies, some writings that you've been giving wide exposure to put a human face on the facts and the figures. Could you explain that?
Yes. The only way you can, press isn't allowed, to talk to the people in solitary. And the only way anybody can get any information, except for periodic visits by their family members, is by letters. The courts have stopped any telephone calls. They can't make telephone calls. They can't look. Usually they have a hard time looking at television. I mean, that's granted as a kind of like pleasure to some people. And, in some of the solitary, I heard a guy wrote me in Florida, they were sent to the hole because they talked to each other. They weren't allowed to talk. And a lot of other people, the older people that I've been around, they try to take care of each other. There's no hospices to speak of in the prisons. And they sort of band together and they try to take care of one another when they were beginning to die, And so the prison breaks up those relationships. They take the guy who's going to die and they put him in what's called a bubble. It's like a glass cage. And they deny his friend a chance to come in and talk to him, to prepare his food, to wash him, take him out every once in a while in the yard in a wheelchair. They deny that. They break up the relationships for security purposes. These are guys who are paraplegics, fought in the Vietnam War, things like that.
Who decides whether they go into solitary? Is there any appeal to the courts? Is there any due process whatsoever to the unbridled discretion of the prison warden or his guards?
No, it's like two systems. There's the judicial system of the judges and the prosecutors and so on the outside. And then there is, in many respects, the real system, which is inside the prison, which is run by the warden. It's at the discretion of the warden. He can do what he wants to. It's at his whim.
Is that also for private prisons as well?
Private prisons, I think, all claim they don't have long-term solitary. But in fact, private prisons hold people in solitary for various reasons. I'm not sure how long they keep them in solitary, but they're definite solitary. I mean, Washington, D.C. has subcontracted or did subcontracted out part of its prison complex to a private company. And the private companies are trying more and more to get in, to this business. They do a lot of the health care, and the health care is pretty lousy. So there's always the potential encroachment in one way or another of the private prisons, which can then protect themselves much more easily because they don't report anything. There's virtually no oversight over the prison systems.
Don't they get more longer sentences and more profit if the corporate prisons throw people into solitary? By the way, one of these companies on New York Stock Exchange, isn't it? The Correctional Corporation of America, Corrections Corporation of America?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest, well, certainly the biggest company in the prison business, but it's also highly regarded as an investment by retirement funds and so on, And the things that have happened inside that group of prisons and other groups of private prisons are, incredible rape charges. And even with the new rape laws, which are very, very lenient, timid, the private prisons don't have to report rape in the same manner that the public prisons are supposed to report rape. There's a good number of suicides, and those suicides have been increasing, not just private prisons, I'm talking about public prisons. And nobody will admit to the suicides. There are no statistics on suicides. They're just deaths. Prisoners in Massachusetts always said, the thing about the Massachusetts prisons is no one has ever died inside a Massachusetts prison. Everyone's very proud of it. And then they start to laugh. And they said, that's because when you die, they take the body and they give it to the civil coroner, and he declares them dead outside the prisoner. So,
This is supposedly a macabre joke.
Yeah.
You cite one study that maybe listeners want to know about. In 2005, 44 prisoners in the California prison system committed suicide. 70% of them were in solitary confinement.
Yes, the large numbers of people who commit suicide are in solitary. Of course, there's large numbers that go crazy are in solitary.
And has anybody brought a suit for cruel and unusual punishment?
Oh, I think
under the Constitution?
Yeah, I think there have been many suits and they never go anywhere. What happens with these suits is that under regulations adopted by the Clinton administration, you have all this internal rigmarole you got to go through before you actually get to the courts. So you can be stifled in you'll have hearings, you'll have interrogations, investigations. By the time it's over with, it's years. I sent a book to a guy in New York State who's been in solitary for 27 years, and he's a gifted writer. I sent him a book, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, I think it was, and he never got it. So I checked it, I tracked it through Amazon, and it showed that the prison had received the book. So I told him, and then he put in a complaint. About 6 months later, they had investigated this complaint, and they had found that they had indeed received the book from Amazon, and it must have been lost. I mean,
Yeah.
Ralph, I'm just curious, what is the definition of cruel and unusual punishment? If solitary isn't cruel and unusual punishment, what is?
It's whatever the judges say it is, David. By the way, we are talking with James Ridgeway, the founder of Solitary Watch, which monitors and exposes abuses that have thrown people in our prisons into tiny cells, and the designation is that they're thrown into solitary confinement, which more and more psychological studies are calling cruel and unusual punishment. And they do this on studies that show what happens to the brain, to the mind of these trapped and incarcerated people, very often having nothing to do with violence, having nothing to do with harming other inmates, as Jim has pointed out. And you can get more information on solitarywatch.com. In all your experience, Jim, about this whole problem, has there been one corporate criminal ever thrown into solitary confinement, even if the conviction was for loss of life due to environmental toxics, occupational dangers like coal mines, knowingly selling deadly pharmaceuticals, etc.? Has there been, in your experience, one corporate crook who's been thrown in solitary confinement?
No, I've not run into any corporate people who've been in solitary. Every once in a while, there'll be a politician, Pat Nolan, who was the head of the California State Legislature for a while, was arrested and convicted of some kind of campaign violations, and he was put in prison for several years. And I think he was in the very beginning maybe put in solitary, but most of his time was in general population. He became so angry at what went on that he's the leading evangelical. He's taken over Chuck Colson's group, and he's the leading evangelical. He fights against solitary.
And what's his name?
Pat Nolan.
Mm-hmm. Has there been any congressional hearing on this in recent years in Washington?
There's been one or two hearings in the Senate, and then there's been so-called oversight hearings, which just listen to criminologists and jail officials in the House.
And Senator John McClane, who was a prisoner and put in solitary, I guess, for some time in Vietnam when he was captured after his plane went down, has he come out supporting reform in this area?
Well, I'm not sure about how far McCain has come out. He's said a great deal, against torture, and I don't think he's gone into domestic solitary confinement. All the major politicians are against torture,
Yeah.
And all the wardens of the big jails, big prisons, they don't have solitary. I mean, I saw a survey done by Mother Jones Magazine in which they simply called up the different prisons in the United States and asked them if they had solitary. And lo and behold, most of them said they didn't have solitary. And in fact, one of them that didn't have solitary was Louisiana, where the guys have been in solitary for 40 years.
Well, how do they get away with these false statements?
They just get away because nobody challenges it. I mean, Mother Jones ran it.
Don't they have different definitions of what constitutes solitary? I mean, if you see a guard, then they don't consider that solitary, right?
Well, yeah, they have all sorts of different definitions, but they call it segregation. There's administrative segregation. There's, disciplinary segregation. There's kind of segregation that lumps together maybe 2 people in a cell, and they're even doing some 3 people in a cell now because they're trying to save money. And, they're about to open, we have one Supermax out in Florence, Colorado, and they're about to open another one in Illinois. And Senator Durbin was very outspoken against solitary, but this prison that is going to be opened is going to be a second solitary prison, in part, in the United States. So,
in Illinois.
Yeah, in Illinois. And, whenever you get into prisons are a great political gift because they create jobs for union members and they create jobs for local people and they get money from the taxpayers.
And what's the role of the unions here, the prison guard unions?
Well, some prison guard unions are independent, but there are two or three that are like in really big prison unions. I mean, there's places that you wouldn't think. SEIU, AFSCME, the Teamsters. Those unions in the past, at least AFSCME and SEIU, have always been thought of as being very liberal and especially supportive of black people who are more black people in solitary than anybody else. But they also have these locals, and they had a local, for example, in Illinois, and the prison guards local fought to keep the prison solitary complex open and fought very hard. And the national unions shy clear of making any clear statements. When Walter Reuther, Victor Reuther, and Jerry Worf were alive, they would use their unions for educational purposes. The only educational purpose these big unions have in this particular sector is to put out really, really specious stuff on the people in solitary and to say that it's necessary to protect the surrounding countryside, that they have to have solitary. And there was one case in Illinois, I think, where they were trying to doctor an inmate and they didn't use any anesthesia when they were cutting him. And someone said, that's not right. And they said, oh, he likes it. He likes it. He told us he really liked it. Now, how can the heads of big liberal unions sit there and have this stuff going past them and not say something?
Look at the figure you give on solitarywatch.com. This prison in Illinois is called the Tams Correctional Center. In their 2009 annual report of the Illinois Department of Corrections, this prison had 417 prisoners, 243 of whom were in solitary confinement. And it cost the taxpayer $92,000 a year to hold a prisoner in this Tams prison in Illinois in solitary confinement, which you say is 2 to 3 times higher than the cost of keeping the same prisoner at the state's other maximum security prisons. So it's 2 to 3 times amount to keep somebody in solitary confinement. And if listeners are putting their taxpayers' cap on, they might be concerned on that ground as well. And that's what has elicited a conservative union with liberals like Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist have helped start a group called Right on Crime, and even the Koch brothers are involved. And just a few days ago, it was announced that there's a left-right alliance to do something about prison reform. What do you think of that?
Well, it's true that the conservatives, especially libertarians, are very, very against this kind of business in prisons, and they're against, federal involvement in prisons in general. And there are leaders in the Congress, conservative leaders in the Congress and, in Washington, who are very much, desire some kind of reform. Now, the liberals really, with a few exceptions, haven't been very active in this business.
They have not?
No, and the mainstream Democrats aren't very active in it. The system in New York, for example, which is headed by, the governor is Andrew Cuomo, hasn't changed any. I'll give you an example. This guy who's a talented writer who's been in solitary for 27 years, he's writing a book. We print his articles periodically. He has 600,000 hits across the world for one story we ran. So what happens to him? He's in solitary, and one night, late at night, the guards come and announce that they're moving him. So they move him at night to another prison, breaking up, of course, all his friendships on the row he's in. And they take the novel he was writing and they lose it. It's like thousands of words that he'd written. And then they take his other properties, including his writings, and they destroy them.
Jim, what does someone like him have to do to get out of solitary? Here he's a writer. He's not hurting anybody, and he's in for 23 years. What do you have to do to get out of solitary?
He'll never get out of solitary, or he'll certainly never get out of jail. He'll never get out of solitary, probably, because he shot a cop. So there are plenty of people who shoot cops to get out of solitary and actually get out of prison, but he just won't. He's scrappy. had fights with guards and stuff over the years. But he's just, you see, the thing about solitary is nobody gets any education at all. They just sit in these cells day after day after day. They do nothing at all. Most of them.
Then why is it more expensive for taxpayers?
Oh, it's more expensive because these guys are thought to be more dangerous. So therefore, whenever they move, like they go to recreation, they go to a hearing or something, I think there's sometimes 6 guards that have to go with them, and when they go to have, like, let's say an interview with a lawyer or with, see a family member, they're kept in shackles. Their hands are shackled or handcuffed, and they're put inside a black box to double sure that they won't get out. So you have all these guards attending to this. And then, I went to visit a guy in New York State. There's a special visiting room, which is sort of a dump. There's a guard at a table. It's like in one of these Russian movies, Soviet movies. It's a guard at a table, slightly elevated. And he's sitting there, and he's listening to our conversation. We're talking about books and stuff like that. So, and then in the middle of all this, he fell asleep. So we always, figure that human nature takes its toll, but they're listening to it through mics and hidden film and so forth.
Jim, you like to have volunteers work with you on this nationwide effort of yours. You want to tell our audience what you'd like them to do, in addition to going to your website, solitarywatch.com, and give some indication of some progress. I understand Maine has started to cut back on solitary confinement. So how can people help your effort and participate, and where are the bright lights in this rollback effort?
Okay, the single most important thing that any person can do without any permission of any kind is to take on a prisoner and write him a letter. Human contact is just so important to these people. Just a little human contact. People who've never talked to anybody in 10 years.
How do you do that, Jim? How do you find a prisoner?
Okay, so we have a project called Lifelines, in which we press people. I get 50 letters a week, which I go through and try to answer. There's a project at Princeton University, and there's one starting in Harvard University, and there are others, I guess, around the country. There's a good deal of work, in California. But the sole purpose of those things is to get going, is to make contact between the students and the prisoners. Because if anything's going to happen here, it's going to come from the inside. Nobody ever talks to the prisoners, ever. Whenever they have one of these studies, and the lawyers get together at Columbia University behind, doors, and discuss this subject, there's never a prisoner or a former prisoner. None of it. It's just academics and lawyers talking. To me, it's the most disgusting misuse of education I've ever seen. And a former attorney general had encouraged all law students and law professors, Attorney General Katzenbach, to go down to a prison and see what it was. As he pointed out, a lot of judges had never seen a prison, never been inside a prison. He wanted the people who were doing criminal law, I guess in all law, to go down and see what's going on. And that in and of itself would just be a terrific eye-opener. Our project simply tries to bring light to this subject. All we want in our project is to make this a public issue that people can look at and see. We want people to be able to see what goes on in these cells. We want people to be able to talk to these prisoners. We don't want them hidden with only one letter, which is written in a little tiny golf type of pencil on a little scrap of paper. I can't read half these things. They're so small. It's like code in the Second World War.
Ralph, a lot of governors have lost their appetite for capital punishment because we're finding out that more and more guys on death row are innocent. Do we have any idea? Do we have a ballpark figure out of the 2.3 million people behind bars in America who are not on death row? What percentage of them might be innocent?
I haven't seen figures. No. I mean, they know what percent engaged in nonviolent activity, like being caught with some marijuana or cocaine. I haven't seen that. You notice, Jim, at the beginning of this program, David, pointed out that people who are accused of crimes, what we call street crimes, don't really have strong defense lawyers. They just have public defenders who, last thing they want to do is challenge the prosecution. They often know them first name basis, go to work every day. and it's very hard work to take these to court. So they basically say to the accused, maybe a 16-year-old, 18, 25-year-old, whatever, they can put you away for 9 years, but I can fix this by agreeing to a plea, and all you're going to get is 3 years. Now, to me, that is abomination of any kind of due process, because the Supreme Court ruled many years ago that people accused of a crime who cannot afford a lawyer must be given a lawyer by the state. Well, a lawyer that does not really defend the defendant and just basically goes through a whole series of files with these accused names on them, copying pleas. I wouldn't say these people are guilty. They never were given a fair trial to begin with. They weren't given due process. Jim, can you tell, as we come to a close, can you tell the audience what progress is made? Because in one of your fact sheets, you say the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Friends Service Committee, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, as well as grassroots groups and prisoners themselves, including ones who have gotten out of prison and are paying attention to this problem. They're beginning to develop a swell of public attention to this. And so have any states start to turn this around a bit?
Well, I don't think there's really been a turnaround, but there has been more interest. I mean, when we started Solitary Watch about 5 years ago, nobody talked about this and people would laugh when you talked about it. Now, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the major newspapers, even the television media and so on, they take it seriously. They talk about it quite openly. The only people that talked about U.S. solitary confinement, where we found an opening, were The Guardian and the BBC. That's where we found...
And maybe Russia Today.
Yeah, sometimes, but not very much.
Jim, I have a question. You may or may not know this. Is Chelsea Manning in solitary confinement? I know she was before her trial. Is she in solitary confinement now?
I really don't know what she does. I do know that trans people have a horrible time in prison. We did a study in New York and found that this was just a series of rapes of trans people. They were always kept in solitary to protect themselves, but not protection from guards who would just rape them. I receive letters from people who say things like, I want to tell you about what goes on here. There was this guy next to me in solitary, was not liked by the guards, and they raped him. And the way they raped him was, there are television cameras in most of these places that are supposed to be, keep everybody straight. So you don't want to get in front of a television camera and beat somebody up. So what they do is they bring the guards in and they circle the guy they want to rape. Then they rape him, and then they claim he was fighting and they had to bring in the guys to calm him down. That's the kind of stuff that goes on.
So it looks like a fight on camera.
No, it's not even on camera. Yeah, you can't see through the backs of the people. It's like a football huddle.
Right.
Jim's Solitary Watch operates on a tiny budget for a big human rights problem in the United States of America. What are the foundations doing on this?
Well, we've had, as you well know, we've had a good number of small foundations and individuals who have helped us. We're just two people, Gene Casella and myself, who basically run this thing, Gene is very active with the people in New York. There is activity in New York City and in New York State, a lot of activity. And there is in California, where the hunger strikes have been. And we're hoping, that we'll see the student-led thing, which can be very big, will help change people's minds and open it up. But it remains the same thing. When you try to get press access, when a media person tries to go into solitary confinement, you get turned down. And if you sue, you get turned down immediately, and the state government will fight you. That was the Cuomo attitude towards us when we sought to visit some prisons that had solitary confinement. They just fought it.
I remember after Attica, we had a national discussion about prisons and how our prisoners were being treated. I remember Arkansas had some reform, some prison reform. We haven't had a discussion about prison reform since then. When would you be better off as a prisoner, today or, say, 30 years ago? Have prison conditions gotten worse?
Well, as the numbers swell, yeah, they've gotten worse. What they're now doing, they talk about all this reform, but some of these prisons are doing is they're double selling people. In other words, they want to reduce the cost of the prison, overall. So they put, instead of one person in a 6x9 cell, they put two people in a 6x9 cell. And sometimes declare whole sections of a prison, basically a segregated section where you have to abide by solitary rules. They have a few people in it. And there's no education. There's just no education at all. Look, I'll give you one example of the kind of stuff that goes on that actually turns stomach. Out in Maryland, in Bel Air, Maryland, they have a jail. And in that jail, they have, various adults that are arrested on various criminal charges. And they also arrest teenagers. And they're not supposed to, but they have been putting the teenagers adjacent to the adults. And then some of these teenagers, like 16-year-olds and 15-year-olds, they should be treated as minors. But because the authorities don't want to bother with that, they pressure them to agree to be treated as adults, which means they go to prison for sure. So the way they do that is, in this particular place, they were taking away the clothing of the teenagers who were in solitary. They denied them all educational opportunities, and they denied them various other recreational opportunities and so forth. And when one woman in that community started to raise trouble about it, the head of the jail said, the sheriff, we don't have solitary confinement. And I myself tried to get the ACLU in Maryland and press people to go to Bel Air and look at it.
Well, they can't define it. I remember when Aaron Hernandez, the football player, was locked up in Massachusetts, they said he wasn't in solitary because he had like an hour in the yard walking around. Is that solitary if you get 1 hour outside a day?
Well, yeah, it's solitary. But most of these guys don't get any 1 hour walking around a yard. They're in kennel runs.
It seems very disheartening because I know that the Supreme Court ruled that California was in violation of the Eighth Amendment. They ordered the California prisons to empty, I guess, about 20,000 prisoners. And Governor Brown, Jerry Brown, of all people, is trying to postpone that. So if we can't get Jerry Brown to fix the prisons, it just seems hopeless.
Well, it isn't hopeless in the sense that before Jim started Solitary Watch, you didn't get as much press, national press on this. You didn't get college students now are picking up on this. There are programs. It's going to become more and more a cause célèbre. A lot of the solitary confinement inmates are getting written up in the South and elsewhere. And so I think the tide, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, I think the tide is beginning to turn here.
Well, people are hoping that's what's going to happen. But I think just last week, there was a fellow in South Carolina who was given 37 years in solitary because somehow things that he had written got on Facebook. And so, that's no turning of any tide. And what they're doing, like in Pennsylvania, they passed a law that says that the victims can get any kind of published material. In other words, if you're in prison and you write something and it's, aired publicly, if the victims feel it harms them, harms their families and so on, they can eradicate it, get rid of it. So in other words, you can basically stop any kind of speech that comes out of a prison if this goes through.
But one thing we do know is that the whole issue you've been working on has gotten a lot more coverage in the last 5 years. And Lance Tapley, who did an article on solitary confinement in Maine, tells me that Maine has made some reforms in this area.
That's right. And Lance Tapley is responsible for pushing some of those reforms through. He's been a one-man watchdog. But, he's one person in one state. And they have made some reforms, but they haven't made tremendous reforms because you continue to read about guys that die there, beaten up, and so on. So in Rikers Island, where there's been a lot of focus by the New York Times and really good reporting, they just continually have, brutal assaults by the guards.
You have a culture of impunity. The guards, the wardens, they are not accountable to the courts. They will never be prosecuted by outside prosecutors. But I get the feeling that sooner or later this thing is going to really erupt and some changes are going to be made. And it's in no small part to the work you and your colleagues are doing, Jim. So I just want to in closing, ask you, can you give your contact numbers and how people can join your effort?
Well, the best single way to do that is to simply go to our site, which is www.solitarywatch.com. And there are all sorts of ways in which you can participate in this, and you can pick whatever you want to do. I mean, of course, you can give money, which most people don't want to bother with, but you can join this Lifelines project and just send letters. I mean, and you can see we have a whole section that describes our history and what we do and the addresses and so on of various places where you can give a donation if you want to do that.
And you have a daily blog.
We run a blog, 2 people here with a couple of interns. We run a blog that has news on it almost every day. We give the prisoners a chance to talk. We have something called Voices from Solitary. And these are letters and communications we receive from various people in prison. Now, we're not picking on guards. We're not picking on wardens. These are straightforward letters describing people's pain and anger and describing their situations. So we've built a list. It's not much of a list. It's over 1,000 people now whom we are in touch with. And we look at them as reporters. A lot of the things we get we can't use and are from people who are very, very mentally ill. And there are a lot of people in solitary who are illiterate. They never get to tell anybody anything, and how to reach those people is very difficult.
You've got an ambitious data bank on solitary confinement. You're working with Washington and Lee University, law school, and other academic partners. So you're starting to branch out. More people are concerned. I think the clinical programs of more law schools got to get involved in this.
Yeah, that would be a great help,
Yeah, because the more the clinical programs get involved, the more the professors, students, and when students graduate, they're sensitive to all this.
Yeah, I think so. And they become sensitive to this public defender problem because there has been a whole lot of support, films and stuff about public defenders. And I'm not saying that public defenders aren't a great thing, but some of these people are really bad.
And also, they're hugely overburdened and underpaid, so they can't handle the cases. They got so many cases, right?
That's right.
Florida is a total disgrace.
Yeah. It's totally true. And also, some of the judges who are elected get money from some local lawyers, of course, and they are then become pro bono public defenders and get cases the judges give to them.
Yeah. I mean, some of them don't even make $60,000 a year, these public defenders. The budgets are getting cut in state after state. But the basic thing is they can hardly devote more than 30 minutes or an hour to a defendant's case.
That's right.
California there was a proposition to change the sentencing.
You're right. Jerry Brown's terrible. He still supports 3 strikes and you're out. So if you steal a bike on your 3rd violation, you go in for 20 years.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think they reduced a lot of drug crimes from...
that passed. That initiative passed?
Yeah. I think it did, didn't it?
I think it did, yeah.
Yeah, it sort of limited it. But it didn't do anything for the ones in there for stealing a bike. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for sharing the experiences you've had with the cruel and unusual practice too often for tens of thousands of prisoners thrown into solitary confinement, or as they call it more appropriately, the hole.
Thank you very much, Ralph, and thank you for all your help.
You're welcome, Jim.
We've been talking to renowned investigative reporter James Ridgeway, whose latest project is Solitary Watch, solitarywatch.com, which exposes the uses and abuses of solitary confinement in our prison system. We'll be back with more of your Facebook questions on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour right after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. And we have time, I think, for at least one of your Facebook questions. This one comes from someone calling themselves Drew the Viking, or if I'm not misreading that, could be Drew the Viking. And Drew asks, do you believe, like Chris Hedges, that at some point the American people will reach a tipping point beyond which there will be a revolution?
Well, Thomas Jefferson thought there should be a political revolution every 15 years. And I think there's going to be a major political backlash by the people sometime in the next 20, 30 years. How much can they take? And with the internet and with examples of what's going on now on many issues, from immigration to Occupy Wall Street, there'll always come a time when people will wake up, maybe led by the young, and push for fundamental reassertion of popular sovereignty over the corporate supremacists and their toadies in Washington.
Can you respond to something Newt Gingrich said? I heard him say that the genius of our system is every 2 years we have a revolution.
You mean in diets?
Yeah, well, they don't work for Newt.
We do have that. We do have that.
But every 2 years, the genius of our House of Representatives is every 2 years we have a massive revolution.
With 95% incumbency?
Unless Newt Gingrich defines every 2 years as a revolution. As gerrymandered districts letting candidates pick their voters, can you imagine that? They pick their voters. Yeah, I would call that pretty revolutionary.
Ralph, how would you define revolution, though? What would look like a revolution to you, as opposed to reform? Because you've been a reformer for all these years.
It's fun. I would define a revolution as fundamental shift of power from the few to the many, not episodically, but institutionally. So that would mean getting money out of politics. It would mean facilitating people to organize their own groups, whether it deals with insurance, housing, whether it deals with food, whether it deals with energy. I would define revolution as breaking up the two-party tyranny and having more candidates and more agendas. And I would define the most fundamental revolution, which is to subordinate constitutionally the corporate entity, strip it of its personhood, and make it serve we the people, not be the masters of we the people.
Now, in our history, Ralph, do you think we've had revolutions in the past? Have there been that kind of fundamental change, or has it been basically the same deal ever since the founding?
I think the most fundamental political upheaval in our country was the populist progressive movement that started in East Texas in 1886. The Populist Party Manifesto of 1892 bears reading today on the internet. That, in effect, gave more people a voice. It gave farmers a protection and regulation against banks and railroads. It gave workers the right to unionize. Credit unions started. We have the beginnings of the civil rights movement. We had progressive taxation, the 40-hour week. We had women's right to vote and the constitutional amendment in 1919. I think that was probably the high watermark. We need far more than that today.
What role did the House of Representatives play in that? Is that because they were able to seize the House of Representatives?
No, it was because they took the populist progressive movement, elected governors routinely in many states. They elected state legislatures in many states, a majority, and they did elect some senators, like Fighting Bob La Follette from Wisconsin, but they never came close to electing a president.
Well, I want to thank Drew the Viking for that question. I think we've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I also want to thank James Ridgeway. His organization is Solitary Watch, solitarywatch.com. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, my name is Steve Scrovan. Join us again for the Ralph Nader Radio Hour next week.
Thank you very much, Steve and David. Thank you, listeners. Spread the word. More radio stations, more assertiveness of popular sovereignty.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell? Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We gotta stand up. Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up. Don't let the system hold you down. Stand up. Hey, stand up. Hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, you should. Oh, step up. Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up. Rise up and take on the power. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Oh, step up. Step up. You ought to step up. Rise up. Rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. I think you should step up. Step up. I think that step up, rise up, don't let the system hold you down. Stand up, hey, stand up, hey, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up, stand up, step up, step up. I think you should step up, rise up, and you rise up because you have the power. Stand up, stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Stand up, stand up, you step up. Step up, I think that we all should rise up, and you rise up, and you rise up, stand up, and you rise up. You've been sitting way too long.